It's strange the way some books refuse to stay where history puts them. Most are written, read for a while, then quietly vanish, eaten by mice, burned in a war, or buried under dust in a library no one visits anymore. The Corpus Hermeticum should have been one of those books. By all logic, it had every reason to disappear forever. It was written in an age when philosophers argued with priests, when emperors were suspicious of anyone who thought too much, and when ideas that didn't fit the script could get you exiled or executed. And yet, this one came back. Not once, but twice. It was dragged out of the shadows like some ancient criminal that keeps breaking out of prison, dusted off and read again with the kind of reverence normally reserved for Holy Scripture, and the kind of suspicion usually aimed at dangerous conspiracies. If you asked its admirers, they'd tell you it wasn't just a book. They'd tell you it was the key, a whispered dialogue between a god and a man, containing the secrets of the universe, the nature of the soul, and instructions for how to rise above the pettiness of the world. If you asked its critics, they'd say it was a pagan fever dream that confused poetry for truth and philosophy for revelation. And if you asked the people who tried to make it disappear, they'd tell you nothing. They wouldn't even admit they knew it existed. The first time it surfaced, it was in the bustling streets of Alexandria, a city where you could hear 3 languages in the same marketplace, and buy scrolls that promised to teach you everything from geometry to how to speak with the dead. The second time was over 1,000 years later, in Florence, during the Renaissance, a city equally obsessed with knowledge, power, and appearances, where wealthy patrons wore gold-like armor and commissioned paintings of saints in the same week they plotted against their rivals. Both times the Corpus Hermeticum caused a sensation. Both times it made powerful people nervous. And both times, within a few decades of its arrival, someone decided it would be better if it quietly vanished again. You see, the problem with the Corpus Hermeticum wasn't that it was wrong. It was that it was tempting. It suggested in polite philosophical terms that you didn't need a priest, a church, or a ritual to touch the divine. That God wasn't locked in a temple, or hidden behind incense and gold. That the universe was alive, thinking, and listening, and that if you understood it, you could talk back. That sort of thing doesn't go down well in societies that depend on keeping the keys to heaven in one pair of hands. So it was buried, not in the ground, but in the kind of intellectual darkness that's harder to escape. It vanished from shelves, from debates, from the memory of most people. The name Hermes Trismegistus, once spoken with awe in scholarly circles, faded into an obscure reference in old books no one bothered to read. But a text like this, well, it has a habit of finding the right moment to reappear. And when it did, in the 15th century, it landed in a world already suspicious of the church, drunk on rediscovered Greek philosophy, and just arrogant enough to believe it could outthink God. That's when the Corpus Hermeticum made its second great entrance, carried by a monk across mountains, into the hands of a dying ruler who decided he couldn't leave this world without knowing what it said. That moment, a cold autumn in Florence in 1460, would trigger one of the strangest chapters in the history of ideas. But before we get to that, we have to go back, way back, to the first time the words of Hermes Trismegistus were whispered into the ear of a scribe. Because if you want to understand why it was buried, you have to understand why it was written in the first place. And for that, we leave the marble streets of Florence and step into the sunlit dust of Alexandria, where Egyptian priests argued with Greek philosophers. Scrolls were worth more than gold, and one man or one myth was about to create a book that refused to stay dead. If you tried to introduce Hermes Trismegistus at a dinner party, you'd have trouble figuring out which biography to give. On one hand, he was the Egyptian god Thoth, ibis-headed, patron of scribes, inventor of writing, and the celestial record-keeper who knew the names of every star and every soul. On the other hand, he was the Greek god Hermes, winged sandals, silver-tongue, messenger of Olympus, trickster, and when it suited him, a smuggler of secrets from the heavens to the earth. And if you asked the people of Hellenistic Egypt, they'd say he was both at once, plus something more. They called him Hermes Trismegistus, Hermes the thrice great, not just great at speaking, or great at wisdom, or great at magic, great in all three. A master of philosophy, a master of the cosmos, and a master of the divine arts. If that sounds like the resume of someone you'd want to have as a mentor, that was exactly the point. You couldn't argue with the title. It was marketing, religion and legend all rolled into one name. The story of how this hybrid god was born says a lot about the world that created the Corpus Hermeticum. When Alexander the Great conquered Egypt in 332 BCE, he didn't just bring soldiers, he brought an entire Greek worldview. Philosophers, mathematicians, physicians and traders poured into the Nile Delta, and Alexandria became the kind of city where an Egyptian priest could discuss the afterlife over wine with a Stoic philosopher from Athens. Gods were traded like ideas. Thoth, who had been guiding the dead through the Hall of Judgment for thousands of years, was suddenly rebranded. The Greeks saw him and thought, that's Hermes, but with better job security. Over time, the two gods merged into one figure, who was bigger, older and wiser than either alone. To the Egyptians, he was still the divine scribe, the one who could speak the language of creation itself. To the Greeks, he became a philosopher king, the ultimate teacher. To both, he was a bridge, not just between cultures, but between earth and heaven. And somewhere in this mix, someone decided he needed to write, or at least someone needed to write as him. The earliest Hermetic texts are written like secret conversations, one voice asking questions about the universe, the other answering with calm authority, as if explaining the rules of a game no mortal had ever been allowed to play before. They talk about the origin of the cosmos, the nature of the mind, and the journey of the soul, but always in a way that feels like you're listening in on something you're not supposed to hear. It wasn't a religion. Not exactly. There were no temples to Hermes Trismegistus, no priests collecting offerings in his name. This was a philosophy wrapped in myth, or maybe a myth wrapped in philosophy. It lived in the margins, copied by scribes, discussed in candlelit rooms, passed along to students who could be trusted not to blurt it out to the wrong person. And the wrong person, in that time, could be anyone with enough political or religious power to decide that private knowledge was dangerous. Because here's the thing, Hermes Trismegistus didn't just talk about the divine. He told you that you could be divine, not by worship, but by understanding. Not by kneeling, but by awakening. That was a problem. Because if people start thinking they can have a direct conversation with the universe, they might stop taking orders from the people who claim to speak on its behalf. So while the figure of Hermes Trismegistus was admired, even quoted, there was always an unspoken rule: don't let this stuff get too popular. But popular ideas have a habit of leaking. By the 1st century CE, texts under his name were circulating from Egypt to Rome. They were written in Greek, sprinkled with Egyptian imagery, and structured like Plato had been on a spiritual retreat in Luxor. They were read by pagans, debated by philosophers, and even glanced at by early Christians who were curious or maybe just suspicious. The Corpus Hermeticum wasn't yet a book as we'd think of it. It was a loose collection of writings, treatises, dialogues and sermons gathered under one mythical author. And in the chaos of the ancient world, where scrolls were as easy to lose as sandals, gathering them together would become both its salvation and the reason it would one day vanish. Because the moment you gather dangerous ideas into one place, you make it easier for someone to burn them all at once. If ancient cities had personalities, Alexandria was the eccentric genius who collected rare artifacts, spoke in riddles, and kept a dangerous number of secrets in the attic. Founded by Alexander the Great in 331 BCE, it wasn't just another port city. It was the port city, the meeting point of Egypt, Greece, Rome, Africa, and the Near East. The streets were a mix of marble colonnades, Egyptian temples, Greek theatres, and the occasional alley where you could buy a scroll, a potion, or a piece of stolen statuary. Alexandria didn't care where you were from, as long as you had something worth trading. Gold, spices, manuscripts, philosophy. It was all currency here. One day you could overhear a debate on the immortality of the soul between a Stoic philosopher and a priest of Osiris. The next, a mathematician might be arguing about planetary motion with an astrologer from Babylon. It was chaotic, loud, and brilliant. The kind of place where ideas could be born, spread, and banned all in the same week. At the heart of it all was the Library of Alexandria, the closest thing the ancient world had to the internet. Except this internet had no delete button. Ships entering the harbour were searched for books, which were borrowed for copying. The originals often didn't make it back to their owners. And the library's shelves groaned under papyrus scrolls from every corner of the known world. Texts on astronomy, medicine, history, theology, and importantly, the occult sciences. Somewhere in this ocean of knowledge, the writings that would become the Corpus Hermeticum began to take shape. Egyptian priests, heirs to a tradition older than most nations, started speaking the language of Greek philosophy. Greek thinkers in turn began borrowing Egypt's sacred symbols and cosmic myths. The result wasn't pure Egyptian or pure Greek, but a hybrid, a set of texts that sounded like Plato if he'd been raised in a temple on the Nile. Hermes Trismegistus was the perfect mascot for this cultural fusion. To the Egyptian scribe he was Thoth in a Greek cloak, to the philosopher he was Hermes with a PhD in hieroglyphics. And in the Hermetic dialogues he became the voice of a teacher who could explain the mysteries of the universe without getting bogged down in whose gods were better. In Alexandria, these ideas weren't just tolerated, they were fashionable. Merchants quoted Hermes to impress clients. Poets slipped Hermetic phrases into their verses. Even a few politicians were known to consult astrologers who claimed to follow the Trismegistan way. It was a golden moment, and like most golden moments, it was fragile. Because Alexandria wasn't just a playground for ideas, it was also a powder keg of politics. Egyptian nationalists resented Greek dominance. The Greeks distrusted the native priesthood. Rome, always looking for ways to keep its provinces in line, eyed the city warily, and religious tension simmered under every conversation. For a while, the Hermetic texts floated above this chaos. They weren't tied to a single temple or dogma, so no one group could fully claim or condemn them. But they had one fatal flaw. They suggested that divine knowledge was available to anyone willing to seek it. No middlemen, no official rituals. Just you, the universe, and a little persistence. That kind of idea was fine in the back rooms of a library. But once it started spilling into the streets, it drew the wrong kind of attention. Religious authorities, both Egyptian and Greek, began to mutter. If the crowd thought they could talk to the gods without a priest, well, what would they need priests for? Still, the writings survived, copied, recopied, passed from hand to hand. Some ended up in the Great Library. Others were kept in private collections, safe from both the flames of censorship and the damp of neglect. No one knew then how close they were to losing it all, because when the political winds shifted, Alexandria would go from being the world's most open marketplace of ideas to a battlefield where the losers' books went up in smoke, and the Corpus Hermeticum would be lucky to escape with even a few pages intact. If Alexandria was a cauldron, then the Hermetic writings were a secret ingredient, valuable, potent, and best kept out of the wrong hands. By the 1st century CE, these texts weren't just a novelty for philosophers to quote at dinner parties. They were starting to feel subversive. And in an age where subversive ideas could get you killed, people learned to be careful. The writings themselves didn't shout rebellion. They didn't call for overthrowing kings or burning temples. They simply whispered something far more dangerous. You could reach the divine on your own. No priest to bless you. No sacrifice to prove your devotion. No golden altar to make the gods listen. Just knowledge and the discipline to use it. And that, in the minds of the powerful, was the kind of thinking that could unravel the whole tapestry of society. So the Corpus Hermeticum began its slow retreat into the shadows. Scrolls that had once been read openly in Alexandria's lecture halls now found homes in back rooms, in the private studies of scholars, and in the guarded libraries of temples. Sometimes they were hidden deliberately, locked in chests with other sensitive materials, the sort of things only a trusted apprentice would be allowed to copy. Sometimes they simply slipped into obscurity, buried among other scrolls until someone curious enough unrolled them centuries later. The people who kept them safe weren't always saints. A wealthy merchant might hoard a set of Hermetic treatises alongside rare poetry and astronomical charts, showing them only to guests he wanted to impress. An ambitious court astrologer might guard his copies jealously, worried that if others read them, his mystical monopoly would be broken. In some cases, the scrolls were smuggled out of Alexandria entirely, traded along caravan routes to Antioch, Ephesus, or Rome, tucked between more ordinary works so they'd escape the notice of customs inspectors and suspicious priests. The Roman world was a strange place for a text like this. On the one hand, the empire was a sponge for exotic ideas, eager to absorb the gods, philosophies, and magic of every place it conquered. On the other, Rome had a long history of crushing anything that smelled like a threat to order. And while the Hermetic texts didn't tell people to pick up swords, they had a knack for making readers think for themselves, which was arguably more dangerous. The texts themselves evolved as they moved. A copy in one city might have extra commentary added in the margins, notes from some long-dead scholar who thought he could improve Hermes Trismegistus. Another copy might be missing entire sections. thanks to a careless scribe or a page lost in a flood. By the time you compared two versions side by side, you might swear they came from different authors entirely. And maybe they did. Hermes Trismegistus was, after all, a pseudonym anyone could use if they wanted their work to sound important. By now, the Corpus Hermeticum was less a single book than a loose brotherhood of writings, bound together by style, subject, and the name of their supposed author. They spoke of creation, of the human soul, of the stars and their influence, of the mind as a mirror of the divine. And they kept insisting quietly but firmly that the world you see isn't the only one that matters. But the shadows could only protect them for so long. And the Roman Empire was shifting. Christianity was spreading fast, no longer a fringe movement but a rising force in politics and public life. And the Church, still defining itself, still deciding which ideas were holy and which were heresy, had little patience for books that claimed to offer salvation without the Church itself. In the centuries to come, the Hermetic scrolls would face their most dangerous trials yet. Some would be destroyed outright, tossed into the flames along with statues of forgotten gods. Others would survive only because someone, somewhere, thought they might still be useful, if only to know what the enemy believed. For now, though, they waited, hidden in the corners of the empire, passed from hand to hand in the kind of trust that could get a man exiled or worse. Because everyone who owned one knew the same thing. This was not a book you showed to the wrong person. Rome had a habit of taking things that weren't theirs and making them Roman. It worked with land, with architecture, with religion, and it worked with ideas. If something impressed the Roman elite, they would claim it, reshape it, and parade it around as if it had been theirs from the beginning. The Hermetic writings were no exception. By the 1st and 2nd centuries CE, copies of the Corpus Hermeticum, or at least fragments of it, had made their way into the hands of Rome's wealthiest and most curious citizens. Senators, generals and patrons of the arts were notorious for collecting exotic wisdom like they collected Greek statues. It was fashionable to have your own personal philosopher, someone who could explain both Aristotle and the latest astrological gossip from Egypt. Hermetic ideas appealed to Rome for several reasons. First, they had that perfect blend of mystique and intellectual weight. They weren't some village superstition. They came wrapped in the authority of both Egypt's ancient temples and Greece's philosophical schools. Second, they flattered the ego. The texts whispered that the reader was capable of divine understanding, that the human mind was not just a servant of the gods but their reflection. To a class of men used to being told they were chosen to rule, this was irresistible. But Rome never absorbed anything without also keeping it under control. If a teaching could be molded to serve imperial stability, it was welcomed. If it encouraged people to question authority, it was buried under new interpretations until it was no longer dangerous. So the Hermetic writings entered a delicate dance, admired for their sophistication, tolerated for their esoteric flavor, but always kept just obscure enough to avoid stirring trouble. There were, however, those in Rome who saw the texts as more than just philosophical decoration. Astrologers, healers, and magicians began quoting Hermes Trismegistus in their work, sometimes openly, sometimes in coded language. Physicians might reference Hermetic principles when describing the balance of the body and soul. Architects whispered that the alignments of certain buildings followed the old science, hinted at in the texts. Still, the Corpus Hermeticum never became mainstream. For all its charm among the elite, it was too strange for the masses and too dangerous for the authorities. The Christian community, growing in influence, saw little room for a figure like Hermes Trismegistus. At best, he was a pagan philosopher who'd stumbled onto a few truths. At worst, he was a distraction from the one true faith. By the 3rd century, tensions between old pagan traditions and the rising Christian movement were shaping the intellectual climate. Philosophers tried to reconcile the two worlds, weaving bits of Hermetic thought into broader discussions about the soul and the cosmos. Some even claimed that Hermes Trismegistus had predicted the coming of Christianity, an argument designed to protect the texts from outright condemnation. It worked for a while, but Rome was heading toward a future where religious tolerance was going to be in short supply. The emperors might dabble in mystery cults and foreign wisdom, but once Christianity began its climb toward official status, anything that smelled like independent spiritual authority became a threat, and the Corpus Hermeticum smelled strongly of it. In the end, Rome didn't destroy the Hermetic writings outright. Not yet. It simply let them fade from the public stage. They were no longer fashionable to quote at dinner parties. no longer the newest intellectual trophy for an ambitious senator. The scrolls that survived slipped quietly into private collections, guarded by families, scholars, and wanderers who understood their worth. But as the empire shifted, the fate of those scrolls would grow more uncertain. Because when power changes hands, the first things to vanish are often the books that remind people they don't need permission to think. When Christianity was still young, before it became the official faith of the Roman Empire, it lived in a complicated neighborhood of ideas. Pagan philosophies, mystery cults, Eastern religions, and half-forgotten temple traditions all competed for space in the minds of the curious. In that crowded marketplace, the Corpus Hermeticum was another voice, strange, poetic, and undeniably intriguing. Early Christian writers didn't quite know what to make of Hermes Trismegistus. On one hand, here was a figure from the pagan world who spoke of one supreme god, the divine mind, the creation of the cosmos, and the immortality of the soul. That sounded suspiciously close to Christian doctrine, almost too close. On the other hand, he also talked about cosmic spheres, astrological influences, and secret knowledge passed only to the worthy, things that smelled more of the temple than the church. Some church fathers saw him as a kind of proto-Christian philosopher, a pagan who had glimpsed the truth but didn't have the full picture. Lactantius, writing in the early 4th century, even quoted Hermes with approval, presenting him as proof that the idea of one god wasn't foreign to the ancient world. This was the diplomatic approach. Look, even the pagans knew parts of the truth and it leads to us. Others weren't so generous. For them, Hermes was a dangerous distraction, a figure who might lure believers into thinking they could find salvation outside of the gospel. The Hermetic text's emphasis on personal spiritual awakening was particularly troubling. Christianity, as it was solidifying its structure, depended on community, hierarchy, and orthodoxy. A book that told people they could know God directly. No priest, no bishop, no sacrament risked undermining the entire system. So the church found itself in a dilemma. Condemn Hermes outright, and you might alienate those who respected him as a wise pagan voice. Embrace him fully, and you might invite ideas into the faith that were impossible to control. The solution was a balancing act. Quote him when useful, ignore him when dangerous, and slowly let his writings drift out of reach for most of the faithful. Meanwhile, the manuscripts themselves were caught in the same uncertainty. Some Christian scribes copied Hermetic passages into their own works, blending them with scripture and commentary. Others left them untouched, unwilling to risk preserving something that might later be condemned. A few even deliberately altered the text, softening certain phrases, omitting others, in a quiet attempt to make Hermes sound more like an accidental Christian prophet than a mystic from a pagan past. Outside the church, the Corpus Hermeticum still found readers. Neoplatonists, those philosophers who saw the entire cosmos as a single ordered expression of the divine, found common ground with Hermes. Gnostic groups who believed in secret spiritual knowledge and the need to escape a corrupt material world saw him as practically one of their own. To these readers, Hermes wasn't a relic or a curiosity. He was a guide. But the Christian world was changing. By the end of the 4th century, Emperor Theodosius had made Christianity the state religion and outlawed public pagan worship. Temples were closed, sometimes violently. Libraries with pagan works were reorganized, which in practice often meant that anything not deemed useful to the new faith quietly disappeared. And while the Corpus Hermeticum might not have been singled out for destruction, it was the kind of book that could easily get lost in the smoke. From this point forward, survival would depend on invisibility. The manuscripts that made it through were the ones tucked into monastery libraries, copied in secret, or carried along trade routes far from the centers of imperial authority. The text had gone from an admired curiosity to something you'd better not be caught reading too openly. The Corpus Hermeticum had entered its long sleep, and as the centuries passed, fewer and fewer people even knew it existed. But sleeping is not the same as dying, and Hermes Trismegistus had a habit of waking up when the world least expected it. If there's one thing ancient history teaches us, it's that ideas are flammable. Not metaphorically, though that's true too, but literally. A single spark, a single angry mob, or a single ruler in a bad mood could wipe out centuries of thought in an afternoon. The Hermetic writings were never the only target, but they lived in dangerous company. By the late 4th and early 5th centuries, the great libraries of the ancient world were in decline. Some had already been damaged by war, others by neglect, But the real accelerant was ideology. When a new regime, political or religious, decided that certain books no longer belonged, fire was the fastest way to erase them. In Alexandria, this wasn't just a theoretical risk. The city that had once been the pride of the ancient world, the glittering crossroads of culture and learning, was now a contested prize. The Romans still held political control, but the cultural mood had shifted. Christianity was the official religion, and pagan traditions, once public and proud, were pushed into the shadows. Temples were closed, statues were toppled, priests were either converted, silenced, or worse. The Serapeum, a grand temple dedicated to the Greco-Egyptian god Serapis, was one of the last strongholds of the Old World. It wasn't just a place of worship, it held part of the library of Alexandria's surviving collection. Philosophers taught there, scribes copied manuscripts, and students came to study the old ways. And somewhere in its store of scrolls, there were almost certainly copies of Hermetic writings, Egypt's most famous philosophical export after the pyramids themselves. In 391 CE, the Serapeum was destroyed. Accounts differ. Some blame an imperial decree, others a violent clash between Christians and pagans, but the result was the same. The temple was stripped, its treasures looted or smashed, and its library holdings burned or scattered. If Hermetic manuscripts were there, many would have turned to ash that day. And Alexandria wasn't alone. Across the empire, smaller libraries faced the same fate. What wasn't burned outright was often dismantled in quieter ways, scrolls left to rot in damp rooms, thrown out to make space for approved works, or repurposed as blank parchment for more acceptable writings. To later historians, this period would feel like a sudden drop in the brightness of human thought. The lights dimmed, and in some cases, snuffed out entirely. For the Corpus Hermeticum, survival depended on luck and location. A few copies may have been spirited away by scholars who knew what was coming. Some likely travelled east into the care of philosophers in the Byzantine Empire, or scholars in the Islamic world, where Greek thought was still valued and preserved. Others might have ended up in the private libraries of wealthy families who saw no reason to hand over their entire book collections to imperial censors. Still, the damage was immense. What had once been a living tradition in Alexandria was reduced to whispers and fragments. By the time the dust settled, the Hermetic writings were gone from public view, not officially outlawed, but functionally erased from everyday intellectual life. The irony, of course, is that the very act of suppressing them gave them an air of forbidden allure. A book no one is allowed to read tends to become the one everyone wants to find. And while centuries would pass before the Corpus Hermeticum resurfaced, the embers never fully went out. Somewhere, in a monastery cell, or on a dusty shelf in a scholar's private study, a copy waited. And when it finally emerged, it would do so in a Europe that had forgotten it ever existed, which made its arrival all the more shocking. By the early Middle Ages, the Corpus Hermeticum had all but vanished from the stage of Western thought. Not in the dramatic, headline-making way that comes with public burnings and proclamations, more like a slow, methodical erasure. One day, it was still being quoted in learned debates. The next, it was a ghost no one dared mention. And then, silence. This wasn't just about suppression. It was about geography. Rome had fallen. Trade routes that once carried scrolls and scholars between Egypt, Greece, and Italy were fractured or gone entirely. Centers of learning shifted. The manuscripts that survived often found themselves stranded in places that had little interest in preserving pagan philosophy for its own sake. In Western Europe, literacy itself was now largely in the hands of the church. Monks decided what was worth copying, and they didn't waste parchment on text that could draw suspicion. If you wanted a chance of survival in this climate, you had to disguise yourself either by blending in with accepted works or by hiding in places no censor would bother looking. The Corpus Hermeticum didn't disguise well. Its content was too openly philosophical, too confident in its non-Christian origin. It wasn't blasphemous enough to be worth a public trial, but it also wasn't holy enough to earn a place on the shelf. And yet it didn't vanish everywhere. In the Byzantine Empire, Greek-speaking scholars still had access to older manuscripts. There, a handful of copies lingered in libraries and personal collections, read by philosophers who valued their historical and intellectual weight. Farther east, Islamic scholars translated many Greek works, Plato, Aristotle, Galen, into Arabic, preserving them while Europe forgot. The Corpus Hermeticum may have quietly travelled with these texts, kept alive in the margins of broader philosophical traditions. Back in the Latin-speaking West, the name Hermes Trismegistus survived, even as his actual words disappeared. He was mentioned in medieval encyclopedias as a wise ancient, often in the same breath as Moses, Zoroaster, or Pythagoras. He became a sort of mythical ancestor of all wisdom, someone everyone had heard of but almost no one had read. It was like knowing the title of a song without ever hearing the music. The few who did have access to fragments treated them cautiously. A stray page might be copied into an astrological treatise, a single hermetic paragraph slipped into a book on medicine or geometry. The text lived on like smuggled contraband, piece by piece, hidden in plain sight. And sometimes, it wasn't even intentional preservation. A scribe might copy a section simply because it filled a blank space at the end of a manuscript, not realizing he was keeping alive a fragment of a banned tradition. By the 10th century, the Corpus Hermeticum in the West was essentially a rumor. You might find its name in a dusty reference, but the actual works were locked away in monasteries that didn't advertise what they had. Some of these holdings were inherited accidentally, collections built over centuries, containing treasures even the librarians didn't fully catalogue. It would take a perfect storm to bring it back, a chain of accidents, political ambitions and sheer curiosity. When it finally returned to the spotlight, it wouldn't just rejoin the conversation. It would crash into it like a comet, sparking a Renaissance obsession that convinced Europe it was holding something older than Moses himself. But for now, in the centuries between its disappearance and its rediscovery, the Corpus Hermeticum was a sleeping giant. And like all sleeping giants, the longer it slept, the more dramatic its awakening would be. The popular image of medieval monks as of quiet, obedient men, bent over desks in candlelit rooms, carefully copying holy scripture with perfect lettering. And yes, that happened. But not all monks spent their lives transcribing only the Bible. Some were collectors. Some were intellectual magpies who gathered anything that glittered, even if it wasn't exactly church-approved. And some, perhaps out of curiosity, stubbornness, or sheer forgetfulness, became the accidental guardians of books they weren't supposed to have. It's easy to imagine the scene: a monastery library somewhere in the Italian hills, the smell of parchment and ink thick in the air. Most shelves held safe, predictable works, psalters, sermons, lives of the saints. But in the back, behind a locked cabinet or under a pile of dusty hymnals, there might be something different. A slim scroll in Greek, a stack of bound pages without a title, a text with strange diagrams of stars and spheres. The monk who found it might not even understand what it was. Maybe he recognized a name, Hermes Trismegistus, from an old encyclopedia. Maybe he just liked the poetic tone of the opening lines. Or maybe he suspected it was valuable and decided to keep it safe from anyone who might want to toss it into the fire. In truth, not all monastic preservation was about principle. Sometimes it was simply about habit. Medieval libraries had a hoarding instinct. Books were expensive to produce, so once you had one, you didn't throw it away lightly. Even texts considered questionable could survive if no one got around to officially condemning them. A work might sit for decades without being copied, only to be rediscovered by a curious younger monk who saw it as a puzzle worth solving. In some cases, these hidden works were protected by language barriers. Greek manuscripts were particularly safe in Latin monasteries, where fewer monks could read them fluently. If you can't understand a book, you're less likely to feel threatened by it, and more likely to stash it away for the day when someone who can read it passes through. This, more than any deliberate act of rebellion, may have saved parts of the Corpus Hermeticum. Of course, there were also the rule-benders, the monks who quietly loved forbidden knowledge. These men copied astrology charts in the margins of hymnals, studied herbal medicine in between prayers, and swapped tales of the ancient world over cups of ale in the refectory. To them, Hermes Trismegistus wasn't an enemy of the faith. He was a window into a deeper, older understanding of creation. Over time, some of these manuscripts made their way between monasteries, carried by traveling scribes or gifted to patrons who supported the abbey. A wealthy noble might receive a Hermetic text as part of a larger donation of books, never realizing he'd been handed something scholars in Florence would one day kill to read. By the High Middle Ages, a small but significant handful of these texts still existed in the West, hidden, half-forgotten, and waiting for the right moment. They weren't the polished volumes of Alexandria's golden age. They were often incomplete, battered, their margins stained with candle soot and thumbprints. But they were alive. And when Europe's appetite for ancient wisdom returned, when kings and merchants started paying fortunes for Greek manuscripts, these dusty, neglected survivors would suddenly become treasures. It's almost comical to think that the survival of the Corpus Hermeticum may have come down to the same human tendencies that save old love letters and mismatched socks. Someone put it in a drawer and never got round to throwing it out. If the Corpus Hermeticum had a guardian angel during its long disappearance from Western Europe, it wasn't wearing monk's robes, it was wearing the flowing robes of scholars in Baghdad, Damascus and Cairo. While Europe spent centuries arguing over which books were holy enough to keep, the Islamic world was in the middle of what we now call the Golden Age, a few hundred years, where knowledge, any knowledge, was treated like treasure. From the 8th to the 13th centuries, cities like Baghdad became intellectual crossroads, drawing in thinkers from across the known world. And one of their great obsessions was collecting Greek works. Philosophy, medicine, astronomy, mathematics. If it had been written in the Mediterranean world, there was a good chance an Arabic translation was made. The House of Wisdom in Baghdad was the centerpiece of this movement. Here, scholars translated not only the works of Aristotle and Plato, but also more esoteric material, astrological treatises, alchemical manuals, and mystical texts that blended science with spiritual philosophy. In this mix, the name Hermes appeared often. Sometimes it was the Hermes of Greek myth, sometimes the Hermes Trismegistus of Egyptian Greek legend, and sometimes a fusion with the Quranic prophet Idris, who was himself linked to ancient wisdom traditions. The Corpus Hermeticum didn't necessarily survive here in its exact Alexandrian form. Instead, it lived on as part of a larger Hermetic tradition, a body of thought that included astronomy, medicine, spiritual cosmology, and the idea of the human as a microcosm of the universe. Arabic scholars quoted Hermetic principles when discussing the movements of the stars, the properties of minerals, and the harmony of the elements. And while the Islamic world had its own theological boundaries, Hermetic thought fit more comfortably into the intellectual climate here than it did in Christian Europe. It was seen not as a rival to religion, but as a branch of ancient knowledge that could complement divine revelation, provided it was interpreted correctly. Hermes Trismegistus, reframed as a prophet-like figure, was given a place of honor in certain circles. This reframing is what allowed the tradition to survive. In Europe, Hermes was a pagan sage, whose independence from the church was suspicious. In the Islamic world, Hermes could be imagined as a divinely inspired figure from the dawn of humanity, passing on God-given wisdom in symbolic form. It was a clever bit of cultural translation that kept the teachings alive without setting off alarm bells. From here the ideas travelled again, westward, through Muslim Spain and Sicily. In the bustling markets of Córdoba, or Palermo, Latin-speaking scholars sometimes encountered Arabic books containing snippets of Hermetic thought. At first these were curiosities, like exotic spices, strange, intriguing, and not yet in high demand, but they planted seeds. By the 12th century, a slow trickle of translations from Arabic into Latin began. These didn't always restore the Corpus Hermeticum in its original form, but they carried pieces of it back into European thought. Ideas about the unity of the cosmos, the link between mind and matter, and the symbolic reading of nature. Like travelers returning home after years abroad, these ideas were subtly changed by their journey, but still recognizable. So while medieval Europe might have forgotten Hermes Trismegistus as an author, it hadn't entirely forgotten his voice. It was just speaking in Arabic now. And when the Renaissance hunger for lost wisdom finally erupted, the Corpus Hermeticum would ride back into Europe on two tracks at once, through surviving Greek manuscripts, and through these Arabic echoes. For centuries, the Islamic custodians of Greek and Hermetic thought had done what the West would not. Keep the door open to the idea that wisdom was worth saving, even if it didn't come stamped with official approval. By the time Europe stumbled into the High Middle Ages, the Corpus Hermeticum was no longer a book anyone could simply go and read. It was a rumor, a memory, a name dropped into conversation by the kind of people who always seemed to know more than they were saying. Hermes Trismegistus had been reduced to a figure in encyclopedias and sermon illustrations, the wise pagan who somehow knew about God before Christianity arrived. You'd find him mentioned alongside Zoroaster, Pythagoras, or Plato, usually as proof that even the ancients had guessed some truths that only Christianity could fully explain. This version of Hermes was safe. He wasn't an independent thinker. He was a warm-up act for the gospel. But beneath the official narrative, there was another Hermes. In certain monasteries, in certain courtly circles, his name carried a different weight. Not the harmless philosopher of school texts, but the gatekeeper to forbidden knowledge. The kind of man you consulted when you wanted to know which stars favored your marriage, how to treat an illness that baffled the physicians, or what the future might hold for a kingdom. These weren't public uses. You didn't exactly put Hermetic consultation on the parish notice board. Instead, references to Hermetic thought appeared in coded ways, in allegorical poetry, in the margins of astrological charts, in the diagrams tucked at the back of medical manuscripts. If you knew what you were looking at, you could trace the line back to the old Alexandrian texts. If you didn't, it just looked like another bit of medieval ornament. The keepers of these fragments weren't necessarily rebels. They might be clerics, physicians, or scholars in good standing, with both church and crown. But they shared an instinct. Some knowledge was worth keeping alive, even if you had to hide it under layers of respectable commentary. One of the most common ways Hermetic ideas travelled was through astrology. The medieval mind took astrology very seriously, not as a party trick but as a science, the study of how the heavens influenced the earth. Much of the symbolic framework for this came from the same cultural soup that produced the Corpus Hermeticum. By preserving star charts and planetary correspondences, medieval astrologers were, knowingly or not, preserving pieces of Hermetic cosmology. Another survival channel was medicine. Hermetic thought's emphasis on harmony between body, mind, and cosmos fit neatly into certain medical traditions. Physicians who worked with herbal remedies, planetary hours, and elemental balances often carried with them echoes of Hermetic teaching, even if they couldn't have quoted a single Hermetic text directly. But the most elusive form of survival was in what we might call the medieval underground of ideas. This wasn't an organized movement, more like a loose, shifting network of people who shared unusual books when they trusted each other enough. A Latin translation of an Arabic text might pass from one scholar to another, each making a copy before sending it on. Sometimes these works contained whole Hermetic treatises, sometimes only a paragraph, sometimes just a name and a tantalizing hint. To most of medieval Europe, Hermes Trismegistus was a faint outline, someone their teachers told them had existed long ago, in the age of Moses and the pharaohs, but to a small number of people scattered across the continent. Hermes wasn't just history. He was a voice still speaking, quietly, elliptically, and always with the suggestion that the official story wasn't the whole story. These whispers never grew loud enough to challenge authority. But they didn't need to. They just needed to last. Because one day, the appetite for forbidden knowledge would roar back to life. And when it did, Hermes Trismegistus would be ready for his second act. By the mid-15th century, Europe had changed. The Middle Ages were fading, the Renaissance was stirring, and in certain cities, Florence most of all, knowledge had become a luxury commodity. Books, especially ancient ones, were no longer just for monks and theologians. They were trophies for the wealthy, symbols of taste and power. The appetite for old texts was ravenous. Italian humanists were scouring monasteries, private libraries, and even the ruins of old cities in search of anything written in Greek or Latin that had escaped the long medieval blackout. The rarer and older it looked, the more valuable it became. A dusty, untranslated manuscript from some forgotten philosopher could fetch as much prestige as a palace renovation. Florence, under the Medici family, had positioned itself as the center of this cultural feeding frenzy. Cosimo de' Medici, the patriarch, was no ordinary banker. He was a collector of minds. He built the first public library in Europe and poured fortunes into bringing scholars and their precious books to his city. If you had a rare manuscript, Florence was where you could find someone to read it, copy it, and praise you for owning it. This was the world into which the Corpus Hermeticum was about to stumble back. But it didn't arrive with a fanfare. It arrived because of a chance journey and the restless curiosity of a man named Leonardo of Pistoia. Leonardo was a traveling monk, the kind of man who moved between courts and monasteries with a satchel full of papers and a keen eye for valuable finds. Around 1460, he was in Macedonia, deep in the territories of the Byzantine Empire, a place where Greek manuscripts still slumbered in libraries, untouched by Western Europe's long forgetfulness. Somewhere there he found it, a bound volume of Greek texts attributed to Hermes Trismegistus. The manuscript contained 14 treatises, dialogues between Hermes and his students, dense with philosophical and mystical speculation. It was, to anyone with an eye for such things, a treasure. Leonardo knew exactly where to take it. When he arrived in Florence and presented it to Cosimo de' Medici, the timing could not have been more perfect. Cosimo was old and in failing health. He had spent a lifetime collecting the wisdom of the ancients. But here, in his last years, was something extraordinary. A work he believed to be older than Plato, older than Moses, perhaps even the oldest book in the world. Cosimo didn't hesitate. He sent the manuscript straight to Marsilio Ficino, his house scholar, who at that moment was busy translating Plato into Latin. Plato could wait, Cosimo told him. Hermes Trismegistus could not. The old man wanted to read the Corpus Hermeticum before he died. And so, in a study in Florence in the autumn of 1460, the ancient words were given a new life in Latin. The book that had been buried for 1,000 years was back, and it was about to cause a stir far bigger than anyone expected. Cosimo de' Medici had built palaces, funded artists, and practically bankrolled the Renaissance, but this, the Corpus Hermeticum, was different. It wasn't just another jewel in his collection. To Cosimo, it was like being handed the blueprint of the universe on his deathbed. The way he saw it, Hermes Trismegistus wasn't a pagan curiosity. He was the original sage, the one who had handed down divine truths to Egypt, Greece, and maybe even Moses himself. If that was true, then the Corpus Hermeticum wasn't just old, it was the oldest. And in a time when the prestige of a text often rose with its supposed age, this made it priceless. So Cosimo made a decision. Marsilio Ficino, his trusted scholar and translator, was already knee-deep in Plato's works, carefully bringing them into Latin for the first time. Cosimo ordered him to stop immediately. Plato could wait. Hermes could not. Ficino later claimed that Cosimo feared death was too close, and he couldn't risk leaving the world without reading these revelations. Ficino obeyed. He set aside the dialogues of Plato and began working through the Greek of the Corpus Hermeticum, as fast as his pen could move. Even at speed, it wasn't just a rush job. Ficino had a talent for giving philosophical texts a poetic sheen, making them sing in Latin. When he was done, the Corpus Hermeticum emerged as the Pomander, a Latin translation that could be read and copied across Europe. The effect in Florence was electric. Here was a text that seemed to unite all the things Renaissance intellectuals loved: the wisdom of antiquity, the mystery of Egypt, the elegance of Greek philosophy, and the spiritual depth that could be framed as compatible with Christianity. It was like finding a missing piece of the great puzzle of human knowledge. Word spread fast. Courtiers, scholars, and clergy whispered about this rediscovered book. It wasn't just an academic curiosity, it was an event. The Corpus Hermeticum was hailed as a lost treasure from humanity's dawn, a work that could reconcile pagan wisdom with Christian truth, and perhaps even prove that Christianity had been foreshadowed by ancient sages. Cosimo got his wish. He read it before he died in 1464. In his mind, he had touched something timeless, a message passed down through civilizations, surviving wars, fires, and centuries of neglect just to reach him. Whether or not that was true didn't matter. What mattered was that the Corpus Hermeticum was no longer sleeping. It was alive, and the Renaissance was ready to embrace it. But hidden in that embrace was the danger. The more famous it became, the more it would attract the kind of attention that had buried it in the first place. If Cosimo de' Medici had been the one to pull the Corpus Hermeticum out of the shadows, Marsilio Ficino was the one who dressed it for the spotlight. Ficino wasn't just a translator. He was the Renaissance equivalent of a world-class editor with a knack for making ancient philosophy feel like it had been written yesterday. He had been raised almost like a Medici family member, educated at their expense, and tasked with nothing less than bringing the wisdom of the ancient world back to life for a Christian Europe. By the time Cosimo handed him the Greek manuscript from Leonardo of Pistoia, Ficino already had a reputation as the man who could make Plato's words shimmer in Latin. Now he was being asked to do the same for Hermes Trismegistus, and in record time. Ficino approached the task with the enthusiasm of someone who knew exactly what was at stake. This wasn't just about making a readable translation. It was about giving the text a voice that would captivate scholars, priests, and princes alike. He polished Hermes's dialogues into elegant, rhythmic Latin that rolled off the tongue like poetry. When the original Greek was obscure, Ficino smoothed it out. When it was blunt, he made it lyrical. He didn't distort the meaning so much as he framed it, placing Hermes not as a rival to Christianity, but as a prophetic forerunner. In Ficino's Latin, the Corpus Hermeticum read like a revelation from a sage who had glimpsed divine truth centuries before the arrival of Christ. The dialogues about the cosmos, the divine mind, and the soul's ascent could be read as a kind of pagan prophecy, preparing the way for the gospel. For Renaissance thinkers desperate to reconcile classical learning with Christian faith, this was perfect. Hermes became a bridge, not a threat. The response was immediate. Copies of Ficino's translation began to circulate, and Hermes' name re-entered the intellectual bloodstream of Europe. Suddenly, Hermetic thought wasn't just an antiquarian curiosity. It was fashionable. Artists wove its symbols into paintings. Poets echoed its phrasing in verse. Alchemists cited it as proof that their work was part of a lineage stretching back to Egypt's golden age. Of course, Ficino's framing also meant that the Corpus Hermeticum gained protection it might otherwise have lacked. By making Hermes sound like a distant cousin of Christian theology, he shielded the text from the immediate suspicion that had doomed it centuries earlier. But that protection came at a cost. Hermes was no longer entirely his own man. He was being read through a Renaissance Christian lens, his wilder, more unorthodox ideas softened or reinterpreted to fit the times. Still, Ficino had pulled off something remarkable. He had taken a manuscript that had been sleeping for a millennium and made it feel urgent, relevant, and even sacred to his contemporaries. It was a resurrection, but one that came with the faint shadow of stage management. The Corpus Hermeticum was now in the open again, celebrated by Europe's intellectual elite. But as its fame grew, so did the risk that someone might start asking inconvenient questions about its origins. And when that happened, the story of Hermes's glorious comeback would take a sharp turn. Once Marsilio Ficino's Latin Corpus Hermeticum began circulating, it didn't take long for Europe's intellectual circles to catch Hermes fever. If the Renaissance was already a party for rediscovered classical wisdom, Hermes Trismegistus arrived like a mysterious, impeccably dressed guest, who claimed to have been there before the music even started. To the humanists, Hermes was proof that their obsession with the ancients was more than nostalgia. Here was a voice from what they believed to be the very dawn of civilization, older than Plato, older than Moses, older than almost everything. The Corpus Hermeticum spoke of a single divine source, the harmony of the cosmos, and humanity's potential to rise toward the divine. It was philosophy with a halo. Artists loved him too. Botticelli, Leonardo da Vinci, and their peers moved in the same Medici-funded circles that were buzzing about Hermes. Hermetic symbols began slipping into art. The intertwined serpent, the celestial spheres, the figure of a wise man holding a star. Even if the average viewer didn't know they were looking at Hermetic imagery, the Renaissance elite knew. It was a quiet code, a wink to those in the know. Alchemists practically adopted Hermes as their patron saint. They pointed to his teachings as evidence that their experiments were not mere tinkering with metals, but part of a sacred science, one as old as Egypt itself. To them, the Corpus Hermeticum was a manual, not just for transforming lead into gold, but for transforming the self into something closer to the divine. Theologians, surprisingly, didn't all push back. In Ficino's polished translation, the text seemed to echo Christian truths: creation by a single God, the immortality of the soul, moral purification. Some scholars even argued that Hermes had been a prophet who glimpsed divine revelation long before it was fully revealed. For a brief moment it seemed Hermes could be welcomed into the family without too much trouble. And then there were the courts. Kings, queens, and powerful patrons wanted Hermetic works in their libraries, simply because they were rare, beautiful, and expensive. Owning a copy was as much a status symbol as owning a palace or commissioning a fresco. The rarer the manuscript, the more valuable the owner appeared, a Renaissance version of flaunting an exclusive luxury brand. It's tempting to imagine that this revival was pure intellectual curiosity, but it was also a bit of a fashion trend. Hermes was in. Quoting him in a letter, or weaving his phrases into a speech, was a way to show that you were connected to the cutting edge of the ancient-modern fusion. The Renaissance prided itself on. But under all the enthusiasm, there was a quiet fault line forming. The more people read the Corpus Hermeticum, the more they began to notice that it didn't quite fit the narrative that had been built around it. It wasn't just a proto-Christian text. It was deeply, unapologetically mystical. It spoke of the stars as living beings, of humans shaping reality through thought, of the soul journeying through cosmic spheres. It wasn't heresy, exactly, but it wasn't safe either. For now, though, no one was ready to spoil the party. The Renaissance had a new intellectual idol, and Europe was still in the honeymoon phase. Hermes Trismegistus was everywhere, on the lips of scholars, in the margins of manuscripts, and in the coded language of art. It was the kind of revival that felt unstoppable. And then, in 1614, someone stopped it. By the early 1600s, Hermes Trismegistus had been sitting comfortably in the Renaissance pantheon for over a century. To most scholars of the time, it was an unquestioned truth. The Corpus Hermeticum was the oldest wisdom in the world, predating even Moses. It was the ancient root from which Greek philosophy, and maybe even Christianity, had sprung. Nobody had really bothered to check, and why would they? It was far more flattering to believe that Europe's rediscovered treasure was the intellectual equivalent of the Rosetta Stone of divine truth. Enter Isaac Cassabon. Cassabon was a Swiss-born scholar living in England, and he had something most Renaissance enthusiasts didn't: an appetite for cutting through romantic myths with cold, historical scrutiny. In 1614, while examining the Corpus Hermeticum for his study of early Christianity, he did something that must have seemed almost rude at the time. He read it carefully, line by line, word by word, and he noticed something odd. The style, the vocabulary, the philosophical references. This was not the language of ancient Egypt. It wasn't even the Greek of Plato's era. It was later, much later. Cassabon argued, with the kind of scholarly precision that makes enemies, that the Corpus Hermeticum was not the work of some godlike sage from the dawn of time. It was written in the early centuries AD, after the rise of Christianity, in the multicultural swirl of the Roman Empire. The author, or authors, weren't prophets from a distant golden age, but educated Greek-speaking Egyptians blending philosophy, mysticism, and religion in a world already reshaped by Rome. In short, Hermes wasn't older than Moses. He wasn't even older than Jesus. The Corpus Hermeticum wasn't ancient scripture. It was a product of late antiquity. A fascinating text, yes, but not the primal source of all wisdom its fans had claimed. For Renaissance humanists, this was like being told that the priceless antique they'd been showing off for years was actually made last Tuesday. It didn't make the text worthless, but it shattered its aura of unchallengeable authority. Without that mythic age behind it, Hermes could no longer be sold as the ultimate bridge between pagan and Christian truth. The fallout was swift. Academics, ever sensitive to the prestige of their sources, began to quietly sideline the Corpus Hermeticum. It went from being the crown jewel of the Renaissance revival to an intriguing but non-essential curiosity. Church authorities, too, felt less need to tolerate its mystical eccentricities once it was stripped of its imagined prophetic status. Of course, Cassabon's verdict didn't kill Hermeticism entirely. In fact, among alchemists, magicians, and esoteric thinkers, the text became even more alluring now that mainstream scholars had turned their backs on it. If the official world dismissed it, that only confirmed for some that it contained the kind of truths the powerful preferred to hide. But Cassabon's discovery marked a turning point. The Corpus Hermeticum would never again enjoy the same cultural dominance it had in the Renaissance. It had been dethroned, not burned, not banned, just quietly pushed off to the side. Still, if history had taught Hermes Trismegistus anything by now, it was patience. Texts like his had a way of outlasting their critics. And while Cassabon had punctured the myth of its age, he hadn't erased its mystery. When Isaac Cassabon's analysis landed in 1614, it must have felt like a cool breeze through certain corridors of the church. For more than a century, the Corpus Hermeticum had been floating around like an uninvited guest at a family dinner, polite enough not to start fights, but always there, hinting at the possibility that divine truth didn't need to come through official channels. Now, with a single scholarly paper, that guest had been downgraded from ancient prophet to late antique philosopher with interesting opinions. For the church, this was perfect. It didn't have to publicly condemn the Corpus Hermeticum, something that might have only made it more appealing to contrarians. Instead, it could just shrug and say, well, yes, it's a nice little book, but clearly not the ancient wellspring people thought it was. This was a much safer approach than outright suppression. By the early 17th century, the church had learned that banning books often gave them more power. Better to deflate them quietly, let the fashion pass, and watch the public's attention drift elsewhere. Cassabon's research provided exactly the right tool for this job: historical demotion. The timing was fortunate for religious authorities too. Europe was heading into the 30 Years' War, a conflict where theological identity was a matter of survival. In that climate, the Church had no interest in seeing alternative spiritual philosophies, especially ones that preached self-knowledge and divine connection without the sacraments, gain traction. The fewer distractions from official doctrine, the better. And so the Corpus Hermeticum began to fade from polite intellectual society. University curricula that had once treated it as ancient scripture now treated it as part of late pagan thought. Interesting to specialists, but not a cornerstone of education. Clergymen who had once quoted Hermes in sermons found it less necessary, and sometimes even faintly embarrassing, to bring him up. This didn't mean the text disappeared entirely. A few scholars still studied it for historical interest, and in certain private libraries it remained quietly treasured, but it was no longer the darling of the Renaissance salons. It was like a once celebrated actor, now relegated to small roles, respected, but no longer the star of the show. Meanwhile, in more occult corners of Europe, the demotion had the opposite effect. For alchemists, Rosicrucians, and those drawn to esoteric traditions, Cassabon's debunking only made the Corpus Hermeticum more attractive. If the Church was relieved and the universities were losing interest, that meant it might finally belong to those who valued it most. The official story now was simple. Hermes Trismegistus was not an ancient Egyptian prophet, but a late antique thinker. The Church could live with that. After all, a philosopher could be admired without being obeyed, and a man stripped of divine authority was far less dangerous to the institution than a man believed to have spoken for God himself. For the first time in centuries, the Corpus Hermeticum was no longer a public problem for the Church. It was something else. Now, a private fascination, passed in whispers between those who still believed it contained a truth that didn't age with the centuries. Once the Corpus Hermeticum slipped out of the Renaissance spotlight, it didn't vanish, it just moved into a different kind of light. The soft, flickering kind you find in candlelit rooms behind locked doors. If Cassabon's debunking had taken Hermes Trismegistus off the grand stage of European intellectual life, it had also freed him to perform in the smaller, stranger theatres of the occult underground. By the 17th century, Europe was riddled with secret societies and informal brotherhoods that treated ancient wisdom like contraband. Alchemists hunched over furnaces, convinced that Hermes' words contained the keys not only to transmuting metals, but to transforming the soul. Astrologers read the Corpus Hermeticum alongside their ephemerides, certain that the dialogues between Hermes and his students were veiled maps of the heavens. The Rosicrucians, emerging in the early 1600s, found in Hermes a kindred spirit, a mythic figure who could stand as a patron for their own blend of mystical Christianity, natural philosophy, and symbolic secrecy. For them, the Corpus Hermeticum wasn't just history. It was an instruction manual written in allegory, each metaphor a cipher to be decoded. Even in Masonic circles where the rituals were more concerned with moral allegory than mystical chemistry, Hermes Trismegistus was occasionally invoked as part of an ancient lineage of wisdom keepers, stretching back to Egypt. The details didn't matter as much as the atmosphere. Hermes was a name that lent a sense of depth and mystery to any gathering that claimed to be guarding timeless truths. The Hermetic revival in these circles had a key advantage. It no longer had to answer to mainstream theology or academia. Stripped of the need to appear respectable, the Corpus Hermeticum could be read for what it was, a strange, poetic, cosmological vision that invited personal interpretation. In a way, it had returned to its origins, a text whispered among initiates, meant for those who wanted to step outside the official channels of knowledge. The book's physical presence reflected its new status. And gone were the gilded Renaissance manuscripts commissioned by princes. Now it appeared in smaller, plainer volumes, often printed in limited runs, sometimes passed in handwritten copies. A translation might be bound without a title on the spine, or tucked between more innocent-looking works to escape notice during inspections. There was also an element of romance to owning it now. To keep a copy was to declare yourself silently as someone who valued the hidden over the obvious, the forbidden over the approved. It was a badge of identity, in a world that increasingly policed what could be thought, printed and spoken. Of course, this underground life meant the Corpus Hermeticum was no longer shaping the mainstream. It wouldn't be quoted in public debates or used to influence the design of grand cathedrals. But for the scattered network of seekers, magicians, and secret philosophers, it became something purer, a personal treasure, stripped of the political baggage that had once weighed it down. Over the next 2 centuries, Hermes Trismegistus would become a recurring ghost in the occult imagination, never entirely gone, never entirely present, always reappearing when the right reader found the right book at the right time. And just when it seemed destined to remain a private fascination forever, the world outside would once again change, and with it the fortunes of the Corpus Hermeticum. If the Corpus Hermeticum had a survival strategy in the centuries after its fall from fame, it was simple: keep moving. This wasn't a book that sat neatly catalogued in public libraries. It was a traveller, passing through private hands, stashed in personal studies, and occasionally resurfacing in the most unlikely places. Some manuscripts were in the possession of noble families who had inherited them without really knowing what they were. A Latin translation might be bound together with other Renaissance texts in a leather volume whose gilt lettering had long since worn away. It would sit on a shelf, its pages yellowing, until a visiting scholar or curious relative pulled it down and realized it wasn't just another devotional work. Other copies found homes in the collections of eccentric antiquarians, the kind of people who treated books as talismans. They might never have read the whole thing, but they liked the idea of owning a work whispered to contain Egyptian wisdom. In these libraries, the Corpus Hermeticum was as much an artifact as a text, valued for the aura of mystery it brought to the room. The wandering didn't always happen on purpose. Wars and estate sales scattered books across borders. A manuscript could travel from Florence to Paris, from Paris to London, and from London to a countryside manor, simply because someone bought a lot of miscellaneous books at auction. In an age before standardized cataloguing, it was entirely possible for a work like the Corpus Hermeticum to change owners without anyone realizing exactly what they had. By the 18th century, a few early printed editions were floating around as well, survivors from the Renaissance print runs. They were rare enough to be considered collector's items, but not rare enough to be completely out of reach for a determined buyer. Some ended up in university libraries, where they were occasionally rediscovered by students digging through neglected stacks. Others stayed hidden in private libraries, their existence known only to the families that owned them. A few manuscripts even crossed the Atlantic in the luggage of European emigrants, ending up in the fledgling libraries of the New World. There they were doubly obscure, an already esoteric text, in Latin or Greek, sitting in a place where few had the time or inclination to read it. But their presence meant that, even far from the centres of European scholarship, the voice of Hermes Trismegistus was still lurking, waiting. This drifting existence meant that the Corpus Hermeticum never completely vanished, even during the centuries when it was absent from serious academic discussion. It survived not because it was zealously preserved, but because it was too odd to throw away. It slipped between the cracks of history, avoiding destruction by never being important enough in the eyes of the mainstream to be targeted. And then, slowly, the world began to change again. The Enlightenment's hunger for historical accuracy, the Romantic era's obsession with the exotic, and the 19th century's occult revival would all converge to bring Hermes Trismegistus back into the open once more. The wandering manuscripts would finally stop wandering, as collectors, scholars, and mystics began hunting for them with renewed purpose. For a text that had spent centuries on the run, it was about to find itself back in the spotlight, and this time, the light would be stranger than ever. For all the drama around the rediscovery of the Corpus Hermeticum, there's a detail that nags at historians and occultists alike. What we have now might not be the whole thing. The surviving corpus consists of 17 treatises, but scattered references in other ancient works suggest there may have been more, perhaps many more. Early commentators speak of additional dialogues and hymns attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, works that don't match anything in our current collection. Some mention lost books on astronomy, medicine, and sacred architecture. Others hint at prophetic verses that have never surfaced. It's not hard to imagine how they could have been lost. Scrolls burn, pages rot. A scribe tasked with copying the full set might skip something he didn't understand or consider important. And during the centuries when Hermetic writings were politically inconvenient, it wouldn't have taken much for a few of the more dangerous treatises to be deliberately excluded from copying altogether. The frustrating part is that we sometimes get only a taste, a single quoted sentence in a completely unrelated work, a vague title in a Byzantine catalogue, or a description in a medieval text that sounds suspiciously Hermetic but can't be matched to anything we know. It's like finding a torn scrap of a map with no idea where the rest of it went. And then there are the wilder claims. Occult tradition is full of whispers about hidden Hermetic manuscripts, locked away in the Vatican archives, buried in the personal libraries of noble families, or preserved in coded form within other works. Most of these claims are unprovable, and some are almost certainly romantic invention. But the idea that there's more, that somewhere out there a missing volume still exists, is irresistible. Every so often, a new discovery rekindles the speculation. In the 20th century, for example, fragments of Coptic Hermetic texts were found in Egypt, confirming that the tradition had a wider and more varied life than previously thought. These weren't part of the Greek Corpus Hermeticum, but they hinted at a diversity of writings that had once circulated under Hermes's name. For scholars, the missing works are a puzzle. For mystics, they're a temptation. If the treatises we do have already challenge orthodox thinking and blur the lines between philosophy, theology, and magic, then what might the missing ones contain? A more detailed cosmology? Specific instructions for rituals? Secrets so politically dangerous they had to be buried? It's likely we'll never know. But the absence of these supposed works has become part of the Corpus Hermeticum's mystique. A complete set might answer questions, but the incomplete one fuels imaginations. It leaves just enough space for each generation to project its own hopes, fears, and theories into the gaps. And maybe that's the point. A fully intact corpus would be a museum piece, a finished story. An incomplete one is a living mystery, forever capable of being rediscovered, reinterpreted, and, in a way, rewritten by those who pick it up. If you want to see the Corpus Hermeticum start an argument, put a historian and a mystic in the same room and ask them what it really is. One will probably start talking about late antique syncretism, Greek philosophical influences, and the socio-political climate of Roman Egypt. The other will talk about initiation, divine revelation, and truths that can't be measured in footnotes. For historians, the text is a product of its time, and a fascinating one at that. It blends Platonic philosophy, Stoic ethics, Egyptian religious imagery, and a dash of popular astrology into a cohesive worldview. It's a window into a world where ideas from 3 continents mingled freely, where a Greek-speaking Egyptian could write about the mind of God without feeling the need to pick sides in the era's religious rivalries. But to historians, it's still a work of human authorship, written by one or more educated people in the first few centuries AD, not a divine download from the dawn of time. Mystics, on the other hand, tend to take the opposite view. The Corpus Hermeticum is not just interesting history, it's a living current of wisdom. It may have been written down in late antiquity, but its roots, they insist, reach back to the temple libraries of pharaonic Egypt, maybe even earlier. To them, Hermes Trismegistus is less an author than a title, a symbolic mantle carried by those who've reached a certain level of spiritual insight. The texts are part of an unbroken initiatory tradition, encoded in allegory so only the prepared can truly understand them. This split means that when the two groups talk about the same paragraph, they can sound like they're reading 2 different books. Take a line about ascending through the spheres. The historian might explain it as a philosophical metaphor for moral purification, drawing on Platonic cosmology. The mystic might describe it as a literal process of consciousness leaving the body to travel through different planes of reality. Both would insist they're right, and neither would be entirely wrong, but they'd be speaking 2 different dialects of understanding. The irony is that the Corpus Hermeticum seems almost designed to fuel this kind of dual reading. Its language is rich in imagery, that works equally well as metaphor or as instruction. Its cosmology is elaborate enough to please a philosopher, yet flexible enough to be adapted into magical or mystical practice. It was ambiguous in antiquity, and it's ambiguous now, which is probably why it's lasted so long. In the modern era, this tug-of-war between historians and mystics has given the text a strange double life. In academic settings, it's studied alongside other late antique philosophies, Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, early Christian theology, as part of a broader intellectual landscape. In occult circles, it's treated as a foundational text, studied not for historical context, but for practical use in ritual, meditation, and alchemical symbolism. And there's a quiet third group in the middle, readers who are willing to see it as both. For them, the historical context adds richness to the mystical reading, and the mystical reading keeps the historical text alive in ways pure scholarship can't. They see no need to choose sides, because the Corpus Hermeticum was never meant to be locked in a single interpretation. Perhaps that's the real trick of Hermes Trismegistus, to leave behind a work that forces you to reveal more about yourself in the way you read it than it ever reveals about him. For a text that's over 1,500 years old, The Corpus Hermeticum has a strange knack for turning up where you least expect it, like a ghost that's learned to blend in with modern life. Most people who encounter its ideas today don't realize they're hearing Hermes Trismegistus at all. The name has faded, but the voice keeps speaking. You can find it in the most obvious places, in the libraries of modern esoteric orders, in the reading lists of ceremonial magicians, in the well-thumbed copies carried by solitary mystics, but it also hides in plain sight. When a self-help book talks about the power of the mind to shape reality, it's echoing Hermetic notions of thought as a creative force. When a yoga class instructor mentions the as above, so below connection between the inner and outer worlds, that's Hermes slipping a line into the conversation. The ghost of the Corpus Hermeticum wanders through art and literature too. It peeks out from the paintings of the symbolists, from the cosmic architecture of science fiction, from the surreal landscapes of video games where reality bends to will. Its core themes, unity of all things, correspondence between microcosm and macrocosm, the soul's ascent toward the divine, are universal enough to slip across genres without anyone stamping them hermetic. In academic philosophy, the ghost is more subtle. Scholars exploring the intellectual history of the Renaissance inevitably run into the text, tracing its influence on figures like Giordano Bruno or Tommaso Campanella. Even Isaac Newton, in between inventing calculus and redefining physics, scribbled notes on alchemy and Hermetic philosophy in the margins of his papers. It's as if the Corpus Hermeticum has been haunting the laboratories and studies of great thinkers, whispering possibilities they couldn't quite ignore. And then there's the internet, a place Hermes would have thrived had he been alive to see it. The text circulates in PDF form on obscure forums, quoted on social media accounts that mix astrology with philosophy, and discussed in podcasts that hop between conspiracy theories, ancient history and spiritual practice. For a ghost, Hermes is remarkably good at keeping up with technology. What's curious is how the Corpus Hermeticum manages to feel both timeless and dated at once. Its cosmology, with the spheres of the planets, the divine mind, and the layered heavens, belongs to an ancient worldview. And yet its insistence that human consciousness participates in the unfolding of reality feels surprisingly modern, even quantum. Perhaps that's why it never fully disappears. It's not bound to one culture, one religion, or one century. It's a set of patterns, metaphors, and provocations that can be adopted, adapted, and disguised in countless ways. You don't have to believe in Hermes Trismegistus to live in a world shaped by his ghost. In the end, the Corpus Hermeticum doesn't need to be on the bestseller lists to keep influencing thought. It just needs to keep haunting the right minds, nudging them toward the same questions it's been asking for 2 millennia. What is the nature of reality? What is the role of the human in the cosmos? And how much of the divine is already within us? The Corpus Hermeticum has had many kinds of readers over the centuries: curious scholars, suspicious clergy, secretive alchemists, and the occasional king or banker with a taste for the exotic. But there's always been another type of reader, the kind who doesn't come to it by accident, and the kind who seeks it out. For these readers, the text isn't just a relic of late antiquity or a historical curiosity. It's a living companion, a voice they recognize even if they can't explain why. They might have first heard of it in a dusty footnote, in a conversation with an older mentor, or through some obscure bookshop recommendation that felt almost too perfectly timed to be coincidence. And when they finally open it, the reaction isn't "this is interesting," but so this is where I was supposed to end up. For those who listen closely, the Corpus Hermeticum isn't just a collection of dialogues between an ancient teacher and his students. It's a mirror. The reader becomes the student, the one asking the questions, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes urgently. And Hermes, in that calm, elliptical way of his, answers not always with clarity, but always with something that sticks in the mind like a splinter. The text doesn't offer a neat, step-by-step program. It prefers suggestion over instruction, metaphor over manual. One passage might speak of the mind of God, as if it were the sun shining through every living thing. Another might describe the soul's ascent through planetary spheres in language so rich it could be taken as poetry, allegory, or a literal mystical journey, and the choice is left entirely to the reader. It's this openness that makes the Corpus Hermeticum both frustrating and intoxicating. It refuses to pin itself down. It will never tell you exactly what to believe or how to practice. It leaves space for the reader to decide which, in a way, is the point. You're not supposed to follow Hermes like a prophet. You're supposed to become Hermes, to take on the role of the one who asks, contemplates, and speaks. The people who've taken that path over the centuries rarely advertise it. You don't wear a badge saying Hermetic practitioner the way you might for a religious order. It's a quieter kind of affiliation, an ongoing relationship with a set of ideas that feels both ancient and personal. And maybe that's why the Corpus Hermeticum has survived in the form it has. It was never meant for the crowd. It works best in the hands of a few who read slowly, who wrestle with it, who let it work on them the way a drop of dye slowly changes the color of water. For these listeners, the survival of the text isn't just a historical accident, it's part of the teaching. The book that has been hidden, buried, burned, and forgotten, yet still manages to return again and again, is itself a living example of what it preaches. That what is truly divine cannot be destroyed. It can only be rediscovered. Picture a small study, the kind lit by a single lamp with a shade that throws a warm circle of light over a desk. On that desk, there's a book. Not a lavishly bound Renaissance volume, not a crumbling scroll stolen from an ancient temple, just a plain modern edition of the Corpus Hermeticum. Its cover doesn't give away much, but inside, the words are the same ones that have passed through empires, monasteries, hidden libraries, and the hands of people who weren't supposed to have them. Somewhere, in another country, another copy sits on a nightstand. Someone else has a PDF tucked away in a folder they've named something innocuous. As if even now, in the age of unlimited access, there's still a faint instinct to keep Hermes Trismegistus close but not too visible. It's a strange thought that these same sentences have been read under the gold ceilings of Medici palaces, in candle-lit cells of medieval monks, in the smoky backrooms of alchemists, and now on glowing laptop screens in quiet apartments. The surroundings change, but the act is the same: a person, a page, and the sense that what they're holding is older, deeper, and more stubborn than history itself. The Corpus Hermeticum was never supposed to be a book for everyone. Maybe that's why it survived. It was never mass-produced in its early life, never shouted from the pulpits. It stayed alive by finding the right kind of reader at the right moment, the one ready to listen, even if they didn't know they were ready until the words began to sink in. And so it remains, not a bestseller, not a relic locked in a museum, but something in between, a traveler. A book that turns up where it's needed, often in silence, often without ceremony. It doesn't care if you believe it's divine truth or just a relic of a fascinating historical moment. It only cares that you read it slowly, that you hear, beneath the style and the centuries, that old voice speaking as calmly now as it did in Alexandria, in Florence, in every hidden room where it's been opened. Outside, the world keeps moving faster, louder, brighter than the age that first birthed it. But here, in the pool of lamplight, the air feels different. The words on the page don't rush. They wait. They wait. They've been waiting for thousands of years. And when you close the book, the room feels a little less empty, as if the ghost of Hermes himself has leaned in, just enough to say, "You found me. Now see where it leads you." We've been talking about the Corpus Hermeticum like it's some elusive celebrity, always vanishing into the shadows, dropping cryptic lines, and never showing up to interviews. But let's face it, at some point you want to know what's actually in the thing. What are these mysterious teachings everyone's chasing? Is it a map to Atlantis? A guide to turning lead into gold? A cosmic recipe book? Well, yes and no. And no. The Corpus Hermeticum isn't one big book in the modern sense. It's a collection. Think of it like a Netflix series where each episode is a self-contained story, but the same lead character keeps showing up. That character is Hermes Trismegistus, a mythical mashup of the Egyptian god Thoth and the Greek god Hermes. Picture a cross between a divine librarian, a motivational speaker, and that one friend who somehow knows obscure trivia about everything. The core theme? The universe is alive, intelligent, and weirdly willing to share its secrets if you know how to listen. And Hermes is here to explain in a tone that swings between philosopher, mystic, and occasionally slightly exasperated parent. Episode 1, The Poimbandre. This is the pilot episode. Hermes has a vision, a full-on cosmic IMAX experience where a divine figure named Poimandres shows him the structure of reality. And this isn't structure like here's a PowerPoint slide of the solar system. This is structure like the entire universe began as pure mind, which gave birth to the word, which shaped light, which formed the cosmos. Poimandres basically tells Hermes, 1. Everything is connected because everything came from the same source. 2. Humans are special because we carry a spark of that divine mind. 3. Also, we've kind of messed things up by getting too attached to our physical bodies and material pleasures. It's like a cosmic TED Talk, inspiring, but with a polite reminder to stop binge-watching life's junk content and pay attention to the big picture. Episode 2, The Asclepius. This one reads like a coffee shop debate between Hermes and his student Asclepius. They discuss the nature of gods, the soul, and how humans, brace yourself, are basically mini-gods with the power to shape reality. But it also contains the famous prophecy of Egypt's decline, where Hermes predicts a time when the land of the Nile will be spiritually barren. Some scholars think this was political commentary, others think it was just Hermes being dramatic. Either way, it's one of the earliest examples of someone saying, "Things were better back in my day," a complaint apparently older than written language. Episodes 3 to 14, Dialogues, Monologues, and the occasional cosmic pep talk. Here's where the corpus starts feeling like a mixtape of late-night conversations. Hermes explains that the physical world is a reflection of the divine world, as above so below, that the soul's job is to ascend through the spheres after death, and that true wisdom is less about knowing stuff and more about becoming one with the universal mind. Some sections sound like philosophy, others sound like science fiction. There's talk of celestial beings, spheres, and harmonies. Ancient attempts to explain physics without having the math for it yet. If you squint, you can see early versions of ideas that would later pop up in Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, and even Renaissance science. Recurring theme. 1. The universe is basically customer service for souls. According to Hermes, the cosmos exists to help souls evolve. The planets aren't just floating rocks, they're like checkpoints or character upgrade stations in a video game. As you pass each one, you shed bad traits and pick up better ones. The goal? Return to the divine source in mint condition. Recurring theme 2. Matter isn't the enemy. But don't get obsessed. The corpus doesn't hate the physical world. It's more like that wise older cousin who warns you not to blow all your money on shiny things. Matter is a tool. Use it, appreciate it, but don't let it run your life. Recurring theme 3. Knowledge, transformation. This isn't trivia night knowledge. It's the kind of knowledge that changes you. Reading the Corpus Hermeticum is like being told, by the way, you're not just a random speck in the universe, you're a co-creator. Act like it. The humor you don't expect. Okay, so the corpus isn't laugh out loud funny, but it does have moments where Hermes sounds like he's throwing shade at humanity. There's a section where he basically says, people complain about the gods ignoring them, but they're too busy worshipping statues and chasing money to notice the gods are talking. If this were modern Twitter, it would be the ancient equivalent of touch grass. The influence? Here's the part where historians geek out. The Corpus Hermeticum lands in Renaissance Europe and sparks a philosophical wildfire. Thinkers like Marsilio Ficino and Giordano Bruno see it as proof that ancient wisdom anticipated Christian truth. Alchemists find inspiration for their experiments. Even Isaac Newton, yes, the Apple guy, had Hermetic writings in his library. Over time, some of its ideas got recycled into Freemasonry, New Thought, Theosophy, and even pop spirituality. You've probably heard phrases like "as above, so below," without realizing you were quoting a 2,000-year-old mystical text. Why it's still a big deal? The Corpus Hermeticum isn't about giving you a checklist of cosmic secrets. It's about changing how you see. In Hermes' world, everything from the motion of the stars to the thoughts in your head is part of the same living system. The more you align with it, the more life feels less like random chaos and more like, well, a story where you actually understand your role. In short, it's a manual for thinking like a philosopher, feeling like a mystic, and occasionally panicking like a human who realizes the universe might be listening. And so we come to the end of our little stroll through 2,000 years of ink, dust, secrecy, and the occasional ecclesiastical side-eye. The Corpus Hermeticum began as whispers between philosophers in Alexandria, carried like contraband across centuries, hidden in monasteries, smuggled through Renaissance courts, and finally landing on your screen, right now. If Hermes Trismegistus himself could see this, he'd probably be baffled by Wi-Fi, but secretly pleased his words survived both the Dark Ages and bad printing runs. What you've heard tonight isn't just the biography of a book. It's the biography of an idea. The notion that somewhere behind the noise of daily life there's a pattern, a meaning, a something that ancient thinkers tried to trap between pages before the ink ran dry. Whether you believe in its cosmic revelations or you simply admire the persistence of human curiosity, the fact remains, someone, somewhere, risked everything so that centuries later you could be here, wondering whether the priests were right to lock it away, or whether the real danger was in forgetting it. The funny thing about forbidden texts is that they never really die. They hibernate. The church banned it, scholars lost it, Europe forgot it, and yet, like a stubborn weed in history's lawn, it grew back the moment conditions were right. Maybe that's because humans are compulsive seekers, or maybe it's just because nothing makes us want to read something more than being told we can't. And here we are, full circle. The Corpus Hermeticum lives again, on bookshelves, in translations, in dusty PDFs tucked away in digital archives. But more importantly, it lives in questions. Questions like, if this was buried for so long, what else is still hidden? Or, how much of history have we actually lost? And would we even know if we found it? Of course, the story doesn't have to end here. You can dig deeper. Maybe you'll look up the actual texts. Maybe you'll hunt for the fragments that didn't make it into the Latin translations. Maybe you'll even start wondering whether Hermes Trismegistus was one man, many men, or just an idea dressed in a toga and an ibis head. And if tonight's journey has given you even a fraction of the curiosity it gave to Renaissance scholars, then the book has done its job, even without being in your hands. Now, if you enjoyed this slow walk through time, here's the part where I do what ancient scribes couldn't. Ask for a little engagement. No, not the ring on your finger kind, the YouTube kind. If you found yourself leaning in, if you learnt something new, or if you just liked the way Hermeticum sounds when said out loud, leave a comment. Tell me which part surprised you most, or share your theory about why it was buried in the first place. And if you think more people should know that this isn't just a dusty relic but a living thread in human thought, hit the like button. It's a bit like copying a manuscript in a medieval scriptorium, except it only takes a second, and there's no risk of candle wax on your sleeve. And of course, subscribe if you'd like to join me. The next time we go digging into the catacombs of history's strangest corners, consider it your initiation into a very exclusive order, the kind that doesn't meet in temples, but in the quiet space between curiosity and insomnia. Because in the end, history isn't really buried, it's waiting. And sometimes all it takes to bring it back is a pair of ears, a spark of interest, and someone willing to tell the story slowly enough for it to matter. So, good night, fellow seeker. Until the next page turns.